Okay, good morning and welcome to class 3 in the art of self-coaching. And let's see, once I get myself-oriented here. Yes, class 3 in the art of self-coaching on attention. Also, I may need to emphasize, so in my neighborhood in San Francisco, there's a construction project going on right outside the window here, or at least not that far away. So you may hear some background noise. I'm sorry about that. There's not very much I can do about that this morning, and we'll manage. So first, let me just provide a little bit of context and framing around this topic. Just like last week, change. Attention is a foundational topic that has a number of implications for some of the other topics we're about to explore in subsequent weeks. And going back to my comment in the very first class about the idea that these topics build on each other. So my hope and expectation is that what we're talking about with regard to change and attention this week, you'll start to see its implications in every subsequent week of the course. So next week, when we tackle emotion, a theme that came up in some of the things I asked you to read for today is this idea that emotions are attention magnets, that a function that they serve is to draw our attention toward perceived opportunities and threats. As I'll discuss momentarily, that is a feature for the species that we sometimes experience as a bug as individuals. Then in 2 weeks, when we talk about happiness, there's a substantial body of work that indicates that what we deliberately choose to pay attention to can have a substantial impact on our perceived sense of well-being, our sense of fulfillment, our sense of happiness. And then in our segment on resilience, one way to think about what resilience means is our ability to manage our attention under stress. Okay, let me just highlight a couple of Zoom best practices that are I think are useful to just bear in mind. First, I want to suggest a different idea. In the previous classes, I'd said, hey, hold your questions until some designated time in which I'm going to answer them. And I'm actually realizing, let's invert that. Questions will occur to you over the course of my remarks. Please submit questions as they occur to you. Then I'll get you into a conversation with your partner twice over the course of this class. And while you're in dialogue with your partner, I'll review the questions and come back and answer them. So please just submit questions as they occur to you. I'll do my best to keep up with them and answer them in the time that I've got available for that. A reminder, if you are able to use side-by-side mode to optimize the layout, that might give you a better on-screen experience. Some instructions related to that were in my previous announcements. As always, if you have feedback both on the material, on my use of Zoom, as I get up the learning curve, here's the email. I will read everything. I cannot commit to responding to everything, but I will read everything. And that feedback has already had an impact. You'll see that later on in today's class. Just a reminder too about the partner conversations. You'll be interacting in real time during class, so you got to be prepared to talk to this person, whether they're with you in person, wherever you happen to be, or if you can maintain the ability to just reach out to them by phone or on a separate video call during these relatively brief conversations that will happen 3 times in today's class. In those conversations, I'd like you to experiment with the coaching process. Not every partner conversation need be a coaching conversation, but certainly the longer ones, the 15 or 20-minute conversations, and we'll have one of those today. I'd like you to bear the comments I've made in past classes about coaching tools as a way to get more out of this. And as always, there are lots of resources on the syllabus for the site under class 1 for additional information about coaching tools and methodology. Also, I've got an on-screen timer of sorts, which I've continued to refine thanks to feedback, which will help you stay on track. Here's our agenda. I sent out a version of this in my weekly announcement, but just to give you a sense of how to manage your energy. I'm going to have a few brief remarks about how we think, and then you'll have an exercise with your partner. I'm going to have a few more remarks about mental control, or another way to think about it is attention management, and then have a coaching conversation with your partner. I'll wrap up with a few comments for next time. So here's the warm-up. As always, I'm going to ask you to prepare a little bit of a warm-up. Here's the prep question that I teed up. What's a healthy distraction that you recommend, noting that in an era of COVID-19, we're in need of distractions. We're in need of distractions at the end of the day to wind down, to manage our anxiety, and it's very easy to get caught up in unhealthy or at the very least unproductive distractions. So what's a healthy distraction that you recommend? I'd like you to discuss with your partner a healthy distraction that you recommend. You got 4 minutes total, 2 minutes per person. Timer's going, so pay attention to that timer on screen, and I will see you back here in 4 minutes. Okay, we are at time for that exercise, and I want to push on into a few comments. First, about attention in general. I am getting on a soapbox here and asserting that attention is your most precious resource. And, we've often been told, well, time is our most precious resource. I'd like you to invert that equation and recognize that attention can be more valuable than time. It can have a greater impact. And certainly we can spend a lot of time with people. We can engage them for extended periods of time without exchanging much attention, without directly engaging each other. And very little value is created as a result. And conversely, in a relatively small amount of time, we can exchange a great deal of attention, a great deal of focused attention can be exchanged, and much more value can be generated as a result. It's one way I'd like to think about these relatively brief conversations that I'm asking you to have with your partner in this class, to the extent that you can put aside distractions and truly focus and be present with the other person and convey that, and having that reciprocated, a much greater amount of value can be generated and exchanged in a relatively short period of time. I'd also want to call your attention back to this very simple metaphorical graph from our first class, and bearing in mind it is a metaphor and it's not a literal bell curve. I am an MBA, I'm not that kind of MBA. Under conditions when we experience a greater degree of emotional arousal up to a certain point, our performance tends to improve and then rapidly degrades. And that is very relevant to how we are able to direct our attention given the amount of stress that we're experiencing or the level of emotional arousal that we're experiencing as a result. And so I would also get on a soapbox here and assert choosing where to focus your attention and choosing what, and sometimes who, to ignore as a consequence are fundamental leadership skills that are more difficult under stress. A theme in my practice these days, in my coaching practice with leaders, is that in the tumult surrounding the disruptions that we're all experiencing as a result of COVID-19, it is becoming harder for people to determine what's the most important thing for me to accomplish today or at this given moment. How can I deliberately focus on a particular task or be truly present with somebody else? So we are experiencing some local difficulties at this in our ability to focus at this present moment. But I would also suggest it's likely to get harder as you advance in your career, as you become more senior. You know, I'm typically having this conversation when I teach this course at Stanford with MBAs who are poised to take a big professional leap. This may describe you as well. And often, you know, my students in that context have a perspective or hold a belief that when I reach a certain point in my professional life, then I get to control the environment around me. I get to have a greater degree of ability to sort of direct my attention. And that is true to a certain extent. And yet, what I know from my work with leaders over the years is that it gets harder to manage and direct your attention as a leader because everybody wants the leader's attention. Everybody wants the leader in the meeting because it makes it a more valuable meeting. Everybody wants the leader's feedback. And so just note, you'll have more and more claims on your attention as you get more senior, which may counteract the ability of your capacity to control where your attention goes. So just note, there's not some magical moment when you get to simply dictate where your attention goes, which is why the practices we'll talk about today become so important earlier in your career. Let me say a little bit about this idea of how we think. I raised the concept of system 1 and system 2 in the reading the primary reading for today on a better information diet. And first, let's just stipulate the idea of sort of different modes of thinking, of the brain adopting different ways of operating. I mean, that concept dates back thousands of years, and we can see it reflected in many different spiritual and philosophical traditions. But this specific idea of system 1 and system 2 began to emerge in what was known as dual processing theory in the late 60s and early 70s by social psychologists, and culminated in the coinage of this particular description of this by these two guys, Stanovich and West, in this really groundbreaking paper that they published in 2000. Stanovich has continued to kind of pursue this path and said, actually, there are 3 different modes of thinking. I think it's sufficient for our purposes. Let's stick with these 2. Also, I think important to acknowledge the work of these researchers because Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist recently based at Princeton, he won the Nobel Prize for his work around behavioral economics and published Thinking Fast and Slow, one of the optional readings for today. It's certainly a book that has had a big impact on my own thinking around these topics. He gets a lot of credit, but really we want to acknowledge the people who came up with this term. Very important to recognize this is a metaphor. we're talking about modes of operating in the brain. Really important to recognize that the brain is not like the digestive system with explicit regions serving explicit and discrete functions. There is so little that we know about the brain and how it operates. There's so much we don't know. So we're talking in a metaphorical sense. Here's a metaphor that, a visual metaphor that illustrates this idea quite accurately, the idea of an iceberg. And it's because most of our mental processing is automatic and unconscious. It happens outside the window of consciousness. The window of consciousness is relatively small, and it represents the tip of the iceberg. We can explore this further, and it starts to raise some really interesting questions. If most mental functioning is occurring outside the window of consciousness, do we really have free will? A question like that is beyond the scope of this course, but I think worth pondering. Very simple illustration, what I mean about the, how I would like to kind of illustrate these two modes of thinking. I'm going to flash an equation on the screen, an answer will occur to you, or perhaps not. So you obviously know 2 by 2 is 4. You obviously know 4 by 4 is 16. You probably know 16 by 16 is somewhere in the order of 256. What's 256 by 256? That's where we tend to slow down, most of us do. So just note, in that shift from system 1 to system 2 thinking, we go from fast, effortless, and involuntary mental processing to a form of mental processing that's slow, that requires some effort, requires voluntary and deliberate action. Worth questioning, asking, who's who? If you just look at this image for a second and consider which one is system 1 and which one is system 2. But note that it could be imperfect. What we're asking here is who's in charge. And of course, a theme in the course that I highlighted in our first class was it depends. In Kahneman's phrase, system 2 is usually an acquiescent monitor. System 1 generates a host of ideas and impulses and feelings. And typically, system 2 acquiesces, it pays attention to what is being generated by system 1. It pays attention to the vast amount of mental processing that is sort of emerging from our system 1 and sort of passes it on. Occasionally, our system 2 is activated in a way that says, hey, whoa, I am in charge here. I'm actively resistant to these, these system 1 impulses. And at times, again, in Kahneman's phrase, system 2 acts as an endorser. It doesn't, pause and say, wait, let me assess and question these system 1 impulses. It says, yes, hell yes, that's exactly right. And sometimes that's when we find ourselves getting into some trouble. Another concept coming out that Kahneman discusses at some great length in Thinking Fast and Slow that's worth referencing here as we consider how to direct and manage our attention is this idea of an attention budget. It's important to recognize that system 2 processing is a limited resource. We don't have the capacity to simply engage in directive and intentional focus for an indefinite period of time. One manifestation of this is, hey, most of us, most of the time, can hold 7 items in working memory plus or minus 2. We've got a capacity in a given moment to be able to focus on a relatively limited number of items or issues under consideration. This is why, and another related reading that I asked you to explore today was the work of Linda Stone on continuous partial attention. An optional reading explored the work of Clifford Dass, the late professor of communications at Stanford, which really highlight this idea of focused multitasking is a myth. What we're calling multitasking is at best continuous partial attention. You can pay very loose attention. You can, you can scramble some eggs and you can fry some bacon and scramble some eggs and fry some bacon and accomplish those 2 tasks in tandem. You're not really paying close attention to either. And if you are trying to accomplish a task that requires deliberate focus, you're fooling yourself as to how effective you're going to be. And to the work of Clifford Nass, you're actually degrading your ability to truly focus over the long term. Kahneman highlights this with a very, I think, poignant line. If you try to go beyond your budget, you will fail. We often find ourselves in circumstances where we're typically operating sort of within our budget. One way I can illustrate that is thinking about what is essentially the modern plague of texting and driving. When we're driving, we're typically operating within our budget, but occasionally something distracting happens, something that requires much more attention that we're able to devote it. And if that attention is being captured by this wonderful, terrible little device, we will go beyond our budget and may fail with quite grave consequences. Here's another topic worth framing here. The law of least effort, another phrase of Kahneman's. System 2 processing is inefficient and expensive. System 2 processing occurs in parallel, again, because of the small window of consciousness and our ability, the limited ability to focus on a particular set of topics or items or objects of focus. It's slow. System 1 is much faster. System 1 operates in parallel. A number of thoughts and impulses and emotions can be generated by System 1 and kind of sort of suffuse and overwhelm us. Whereas System 2 much slower. And as a consequence, we've evolved, again, in Kahneman's phrase, to be cognitive misers. So we're lazy, or if you want to put a positive spin on it, we're economical. We try to conserve this resource for when it is most needed. As a consequence, we're always seeking shortcuts, but this results in systematic biases in the ways we think. Here's a way I'd like you to frame this. These are features that act like bugs. They're ways of thinking that benefit the species, that usually benefit us as individuals. 99.x% of the time, they benefit us. They work to our advantage. It's why we've evolved this quite elegant mechanism. But occasionally, we run into a situation where they work against our individual aspirations or goals. And so it's important to recognize occasionally we're going to, these ways of thinking are going to get us into trouble. I ask you to consider a few in particular. One is it's really kind of an overarching theme, not just for this week, but also for next week. Emotions are attention magnets. A function that they serve, a function that emotions serve, is to alert us to potential opportunities and potential threats, to draw us toward the potential opportunities and ward us away from the potential threats. And the vast majority of time, this serves us quite well. And occasionally, it gets us into trouble. Daniel Wegner, one of the great thinkers on this whole topic of mental control or attention management. And late psychologist did his most well-known work at Harvard, and one of the optional readings on today's syllabus. He's got this great line: "It is clear that emotion should not be very susceptible to willful control. If we could turn off all our emotions, we could easily end up dead." Quite a profound thought, especially when we bear in mind, occasionally I wish I could just turn off these distracting feelings because they're either causing me to be kind of drawn into something that is really counterproductive, or they're causing me to ignore something that I really should be paying attention to. I wish I could just focus. And that's understandable impulse, and yet important to bear in mind, under many circumstances, this would leave us extremely vulnerable. It's why we've evolved this, again, quite elegant mechanism that occasionally we experience as a bug. Another concept, this idea of the narrative engine, our propensity, and in fact, our inevitability of creating stories. We make up stories that explain a situation. I'm going to flash an image on the screen for a second here. Just take a few seconds and observe this scene. I want you to just pause and bear in mind that you are, no doubt, creating a story. You've created a story just in the few seconds that you looked at that image that explains to you at some level what's going on. Also, let's connect back to this idea that emotions are attention magnets. When we look at this image, there are a number of data points that suggest some emotion. The woman on the left is leaning forward with her mouth open. What is she? Is she, skeptical? Is she aghast? Is she upset? The guy on the right is sort of leaning back. He looks a little pleased with himself, or a little smug, or a little confused. It's impossible to not create a story that explains this situation in just a few seconds, extrapolating on a particular, small data set, and yet. It's also really important to bear in mind, we have no idea what's going on here. We have literally no idea what is going on here. We're just making up a story. And to Kahneman's point, the measure of success for System 1 is the coherence of the story it manages to create. The amount and quality of the data on which the story is based are largely irrelevant. Think of this, once again, as a feature for the species that we often experience as a bug as individuals. We have evolved in such a way that our brain is essentially saying it's safer to take a very small, limited set of data and rapidly, immediately construct a coherent narrative and use that narrative to navigate this situation, this uncertain situation that we encounter. And by and large, that serves us quite well because we don't stop and consider the ways in which we craft an explanatory narrative that allows us to navigate a situation safely. What happens is occasionally we construct an explanatory narrative that is dead wrong. And then we have to navigate a situation quite ineffectively. So we can't turn this off, but important to gain a perspective on what are the circumstances under which my narrative engine tends to misinterpret certain kinds of data points. Lastly, this theme of social comparison, this idea that we are inevitably kind of looking over our shoulder at our comparisons at other people and sensing how are we doing relative to them. Sonia Lyubomirsky, whose work we'll encounter both next week in our 2 weeks hence in our class on happiness, and then near the end of the course in our class on success, she says, hey, it's impossible not to compare ourselves with others. Social comparisons arrive naturally, automatically, and effortlessly. And again, we should think of that as a feature for the species. If we go back to sort of our evolutionary origins, it's important for us as beings that evolved in groups of 150 to 200 primates to understand how am I doing relative to the rest of the group? How am I doing to the rest of the tribe? If I'm falling behind, if I'm losing opportunities or advantages, I may be at risk. And in many ways, that's a feature for the species, but often we experience that as a bug as individuals. So what can we do? Well, let me start with this idea of a better information diet, about being thoughtful and deliberate about where we're directing our attention and what we are allowing in, which I think is particularly important in this era of COVID-19. I teed up an exercise for today involving your worksheets and your phones. I asked you to consider your phone in light of these dynamics. Emotions are attention magnets, the narrative engine, social comparison. I ask you to reflect on these questions. How does my phone trigger emotions? How does it engage me in stories of any kind? How does it evoke social comparisons? I ask you to consider the features on your phone that enable these dynamics. Which ones did you choose? Which ones were chosen for you? And how useful or necessary are they? So I want you to then now go into another discussion with your partner around these particular questions. This is not necessarily a coaching conversation. I just want you to have a 10-minute sort of information gathering session with your partner. How might you use these tools differently? How could we make them less disruptive with regard to directing our attention? I will see you back here in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Wherever you are, I got to ask you to hit pause in these conversations so we can move on. I would like you to bear in mind that and a really common theme in this class is I'm presenting you with a variety of conceptual material that I hope has some impact on you sort of intellectually. I hope stimulate some ideas and thinking. And if it doesn't translate into behavioral experiments, it's not going to be useful. The whole point of this course is to take these ideas and translate them into some experiments. So hopefully this conversation with your partner spurred some specific steps, some experiments that you'd like to run. Let me take a few minutes and just answer and address some questions that came up. First, some folks have highlighted, hey, the side-by-side mode is not working. I'm not aware of a feature or a way to enable or disable that on my end. So it may just be something that has changed in Zoom since we've begun using this tool. But I will look into that a little bit further. Also, the question got raised, well, what is a healthy distraction? And well, first, it's an extremely, as with so many of the topics we'll explore, extremely subjective. I don't think there's a specific way to define what is healthy for, in kind of a universal sense. What is healthy for some of us, maybe unhealthy for others. But first, just recognizing we are likely to get, because of the dynamics that I just touched on, we're likely to get drawn into absorbing experiences that may or may not be useful or productive for us, especially during this particular era, during this societal moment. We're also likely to find it difficult to focus on things that are particularly important to us. So important to kind of just even stop and get a sense of saying, where is my attention going? Is it being directed towards something that I find particularly useful? A theme that comes up quite a lot in my practice right now is people feeling, especially in a leadership position, I'm obligated to be a really responsible consumer of the news. I've got to stay up on the news. I've got to be very well informed. And of course, up to a certain point, that's necessary and important for a leader. And beyond a certain point, it's probably unhealthy. It's not a healthy distraction. It's not going to be something where you're going to be actually learning something that's useful to allow you to support your employees or your organization more effectively. Question was also raised, well, how do we grow our attention budget? And that's something I'm going to talk about both later in this class, and it will be something we'll touch on in another way related to emotion, because of this idea that emotions are attention magnets. So we can both expand our capacity to feel less depleted with over a longer period of time, and improve our ability to focus. And none of that rests on a kind of sort of switch being flipped and a kind of, suddenly we were able to, it's, a way to think of this as very physiologically rooted, and like all organic processes, change is slow. Question related to the timing of sequential focused activity versus multitasking with switching costs. Essentially, like how long do we need to be engaged in a topic before we can sort of view it, or how long do we need to be engaged in a topic in a particular deliberate object of focus in order to minimize the risk of switching costs? Well, the research that comes to mind is this idea that when we are engaged in a topic and we get distracted, it can take us roughly 20 minutes to get back to the same level of focus. So I think a relatively long period of time. And also just bearing in mind this work by Clifford Ness, that when we allow ourselves to multitask, we degrade our ability to focus repeatedly. There are some other questions that came up that I will try to address after our next coaching conversation, or after the next coaching conversation I ask you to hold with your partner, and I want to push on for a moment. Before I do start talking about mental control and attention management, I'd like to emphasize why am I belaboring this? Why am I saying, why am I getting on a soapbox and preaching this and talking about why I believe this is so important? Well, to a point that I raise in the information diet reading, I think it's essential to acknowledge that we are living in an attention economy. What we pay attention to is one of the primary drivers, and increasingly the most important driver of value. Our attention generates value. And as a consequence, we are not merely consumers. Everything that you are paying attention to. I mean, it's easy, I think, to be fooled into imagining that we're a consumer of this product that's capturing my attention. And I think it's important to bear in mind, we are also the product. Our attention is being captured and monetized. And as a consequence, important to recognize that these, wonderful, terrible little devices, it is that device, and it's the role that it plays in your life. It's the tip of a very long tentacle that reaches from immense, well-organized systems. And so behind the screen, behind the screen of every one of these devices with which we engage and which captures our attention are thousands, hundreds of thousands of some of the smartest people in the world who are extremely well-funded and well-organized, with their sole mission being to distract us, to capture our attention. We're just trying to make the foul shot. And that's not necessarily, our goals are not necessarily aligned with people who are trying to capture our attention. So recognizing we are not in a position to just direct our attention because we're operating in the midst of this vast system, this attention economy that's looking to capture, hijack, and monetize our attention. And unless we are able to take some steps and intervene, our attention is going to go where other people want it to go. So let's talk a little bit about mental control. It's sort of a term of art in psychology, and I'd like you to think of it in a more prosaic way as attention management, being able to manage where our attention goes, to the point I just made. Here's a key line from Dostoevsky that gave from which derives the title of the piece that I asked you to read about white bears. Try to pose for yourself this task, not to think of a polar bear, and you will see that the cursed thing will come to mind every minute. This is the phrase that Daniel Wegner inspired the title of Daniel Wegner's book, White Bears and Other Unwanted Thoughts. Wegner tells us people can control their mental states just by trying to direct their thoughts. These strategies of mental control can sometimes backfire, however. Important to bear in mind that just trying to deliberately focus on something can actually have an undesired effect, or trying to ignore something can have the undesired counterproductive effect. So let's talk a little bit about this process of mental control. And now Wegner's work, and this is one of the first early edition of Wegner's work. It's an optional reading on today's syllabus because it was impossible for me to find a way to actually get the permission to share this. One of my favorite books on our syllabus. And Wegner, sadly a brilliant man who died relatively young, in his 50s. He explores the various forms of mental control. It's just starting with Freud. He says, hey, we're going to try to suppress unwanted ideas. And Wegner has a fairly, I think, a very elegant explanation for why efforts to suppress things we don't want to think about tend not to work. So go back to Dostoevsky's example, try not to think of a polar bear. Well, the instruction, try not to think of, contains the idea of polar bear. So, Wegner's idea is that this sort of, the surrounding thought, the direction of trying not to think about something, inevitably contains the object thought, this idea of a polar bear. And so we remind ourselves of what exactly we're trying to ignore. Thus, the sort of limitations on Freud's idea that we are seeking to suppress unwanted ideas. Wegner also talks about James's idea, the sort of founding father of modern psychology, that we can direct our attention merely by concentrating. Merely by expending system 2, mental processing, to deliberately focus on what we want to pay attention to. That's where it's important to bear in mind what we've learned about how the brain works, and we've talked about the first half of class, and recognizing we experience that as depleting. It is a limited resource, and so inevitably we run out of gas. We can't concentrate indefinitely, and although we may experience that as a bug, it's a feature. It's good for us to be able to ensure that we get interrupted. So noting these ways of trying to understand efforts, pathways to mental control and attention management, they're almost always insufficient, and they're sometimes actively counterproductive. There is an alternative, though, and here Wegner draws on the work of the great educator John Dewey, asks us to think about habit. Dewey has this great line that Wegner quotes: habit must intervene between wish and execution in the case of bodily acts, but we still cherish the illusion that they can be dispensed with in the case of mental and moral acts. Going back to a point I made earlier about recognizing the sort of physiological and organic roots of all of this, really important to bear in mind that so many of the things that we're trying to accomplish when we're looking to direct our attention are not merely sort of a kind of intellectual, mental process, but very much a bodily process. Think about driving. for example, which I just touched on earlier. Driving is, of course, an intellectual cognitive process. We're taking a lot of information, and it's a very physiological process. Our bodies are involved in helping us decide what to do and how to respond. Very true in lots of other circumstances as well. And because Wegner does sometimes fail to acknowledge in some ways James's contributions. Important to recognize that he also has something I think that's quite relevant here to add. Could the young but realize how soon they will become mere walking bundles of habits, they would give more heed to their conduct while in the plastic state. Now, in some ways, this runs quite counter to what we know about how the brain actually works and the extension of neuroplasticity well into the last stages of life. Even I, by advanced age, am still capable of neuroplasticity. And yet, just with regard to how our lives are structured and the habits that we cultivate, certainly easier in lots of ways to shift habits before a variety of circumstances influence our ability to make change and to cultivate, and so thus the importance of cultivating routines that help us direct our attention where they want to go. This brings us to the work of Brad Stulberg and Steve Magnus, who are drawing on the work of a number of thinkers, including Carol Dweck, who we talked about last week, and Kelly McGonigal, also of Stanford. Now, Brad and Steve, in their work, in the excerpt I have to read from Peak Performance, they talk about perfect practice. I think that sets the bar in a particular way that you may not find useful. So let's emphasize deliberate practice. Now, this also draws on the research that we touched on last week by Anders Ericsson, and which got sort of popularized as the 10,000 hours rule. Again, important to acknowledge that we're not just talking about time. We're not just talking about the input. What we're talking about is focused attention, and recognizing that attention can allow us to have a much greater impact on others and exchange of value. Now, when we go into an activity with some deliberate focus in mind, when we step into an activity with the intention of being very specifically focused on a given a task that we want to accomplish and an outcome that we want to achieve, we will experience this as depleting. At some level, our concentration will waver. We can't just bear down as James would have us do. And this is a good thing, if we bear in mind the idea that system 2 processing is a finite and limited resource, and we've evolved this elegant system that ensures that we conserve it for the most important moments. So, focused attention, it's a finite resource, and thus it's going to be very difficult for us to just kind of bear down and deliberately practice, even though that's so important. So what can we do? Well, bear in mind that there's some help along the way when we repeatedly engage in a process that we want to persist with. Any repeated exposure to a given circumstance allows us to experience some cognitive ease, the term of art from psychology. We're less emotionally aroused. So if you go back to the bell curve earlier, if we're stepping into a new set of circumstances or a new situation, we may become a little distressed. It may be harder to focus. So if we repeatedly engage in this practice, we may back ourselves down the curve, be a little less distressed. It'll be easier to focus. Also, as we develop skill in a task, it requires less mental effort to engage in it. I'm asking you in these conversations with your partners at times to use coaching as a tool and a methodology. And for many folks who are trying that out for the first time, whether it's with a partner or with an employee or in any other relationship where you're not just kind of showing up in a casual conversation, it can be a little distracting. I'm thinking about an additional set of questions that I have to ask. I can't just I don't feel particularly skillful as a coach. That requires more mental effort. And as we repeatedly engage in that process, where we feel a greater sense of cognitive ease, we develop more skills, it's easier. And any habitual activity that we engage in, there's a lower demand on system 2. This also very much goes back to some of the topics that we talked about with regard to change and goal setting. The more we have to think about whether or not we're going to engage in a given desired activity at a given time, the less likely we are to do it. If we can make it habitual, if we can make it routine. So going back to this idea of structures that we might put in place in our lives to ensure that we're not only engaging in the activities that we want to engage in, but also directing our attention towards the desired object of focus and away from counterproductive distractions. So what else can we do? And this touches on some of the questions that I received earlier. Well, we can build our capacity. We can build our capacity for attention management. Now, I am committed to the idea of minimizing crappy acronyms. Cheesy acronyms abound in management education. I experienced a lot of them when I was an MBA student. My goal is to inflict as few of them on you as possible. So I've got basically one in this course. You can get messy. I also just like using this funny picture of this kid who I think is really adorable. What do I mean by this? What does this stand for? For practices, mindfulness, exercise, sleep hygiene, creating an environment in which our quality of sleep is going to be as good as possible, and stress reduction, by which I mean minimizing the low levels of chronic stress that we experience. I'm not going to talk about the latter three this week. I will come back and talk about them briefly next week in our class on emotion. Today, I just want to focus on mindfulness because of its great significance for attention. So here's a response that we often have, when we're asked to think about mindfulness. And I want to reframe it. I want to offer you the simplest possible definition of mindfulness. It's merely non-judgmental awareness and acceptance of experience. Oh, this is happening. And I think that's extremely relevant for our lives in the era of COVID-19. Oh, this is happening. I'm going to assert that this is the single most powerful self-coaching tool critical to attention and emotion management. However, there's a dilemma with regard to how meditation is marketed at us. And I think it's really important to recognize that meditation is being marketed. We are the subjects of extensive meditation marketing campaigns. And many of them essentially employ imagery like this. Some skinny yoga instructor sitting in the ocean in what looks like an extremely uncomfortable position. I don't know about you, but I do not identify with this. This doesn't motivate me in any way. I don't know what the heck is going on here. I don't really want any part of this. But when I think of meditation, I don't think of some skinny yoga instructor in an uncomfortable position in the ocean. I think of this guy. This is Bill George. Bill George, revered professor of management at Harvard Business School. But he reached that august position because of his success as the CEO of Medtronic for many years, the massive medical device and services company. Bill George came to my attention in 2009 when he came to give a talk at the Stanford Faculty Club. And at that time, I had been interested in meditation for a period, but I'd never been really successful. I'd thought about it, I'd heard about it, it had been promoted to me from a variety of perspectives. And it didn't seem like it was really for me. And then I saw this guy coming and talking at the faculty club. And this guy said that he and his wife had been meditating every day for 30 years. That really got my attention. This guy, the sort of quintessential example of the sort of square, straight-laced Midwestern businessman. He had been meditating every day for 30 years. That made me think there was something more to explore there, and I really needed to buckle down and pursue it. And so I did. And what has resulted is this framing that I'd like you to kind of adopt for meditation as a practice. It is the repeated effort over and over and over and over in directing your attention back to a desired object of focus. Because of the way our minds work, it is not possible to clear your mind. I mean, I'm not going to assert that that's true for everybody, but what I've experienced in my work of trying to introduce people who are open to the idea of meditation to kind of get involved with it and actually commit to it as a consistent practice, is this idea that, I start meditating and I'm immediately distracted. And so I feel essentially demotivated and a little stressed because I'm not a very good meditator. And that's how we're wired. It's the way the brain works. So it's this repeated effort that is actually the workout from which through which we can cultivate this habit of attention management. What's going on here, ultimately, should we persist in this practice, is what's known as self-directed neuroplasticity. This idea that by thinking, by directing our attention intentionally, we can literally change structures in the brain. Research that I'm just cite really briefly says, hey, with essentially 10 minutes of practice over a period of 2 months, that's where we start to see, that's where we start to measure changes in brain structures and relationships between neural networks. So remember, it is a workout. It is not a break. You know, why meditation is so often experienced as demotivating by people who are new to the practice is it's marketed to us as a break. Meditate and you'll feel better. You'll feel calmer. You'll feel less stressed. Well, maybe. Often that's not the case. In fact, you may feel a little anxious. You may feel more stressed. And I'd like you to think about it as a workout, because like any workout, you might experience it as a little stressful, a little depleting. And the goal here, the idea is that you are cultivating this habit of attention management and expanding your capacity for it. Consistent practice is the key. I don't try to do it. My aspiration is to meditate every day. I think as I've written somewhere, perfect attendance record is not my, life's aspiration. And I do pay attention. I track the data, and I have for at this point 12 years. Am I meditating on a daily basis? And the idea is not because I've got to have some like 10,000-day streak. The idea is simply that we know from the research, consistent practice is what makes the difference. If you're finding it difficult to get started, try 1 minute a day and work up. And I mean that quite literally. Set the bar quite low, because going back to a theme from our class on change, the idea is to develop some momentum, not to set the bar so high that you then experience it as demotivating and fail to accomplish your goals. So with that, I want to tee up a conversation. And this conversation, I'd like you to deliberately think of as a coaching conversation. I asked you to prepare for class by just reflecting briefly on these questions. How am I managing my attention now? Or how am I failing to? And what experiments might I run? And hopefully both the material that I ask you to read, as well as what I just talked about, provide you with some inspiration to reflect on. So starting now, I'd like you to engage in a coaching conversation with your partner, 8 minutes per person. How am I managing my attention now? What experiments might I run? I'll see you back here in 16 minutes. And the timer is set up hopefully in a way that makes it easier for you to recognize there's a halfway mark, and then it's time for person B to coach person A. I'll see you back here in 16 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Wherever you are, I'm going to have to ask you to hit pause in this conversation. Um, Please remember to thank your partner. And I'm just realizing as I'm looking at this slide that there's a typo. And of course there is. All right. Be that as it may, please do remember to thank this person with whom you're spending this time and investing in each other. Let me take a few minutes and just answer some questions then. So a whole host of questions came up related to both some of the topics that we explored in the first half of class and to what we just talked about. Question about the relationship between the narrative engine, our propensity, the inevitable process of creating an explanatory narrative, and our mental models. And there is absolutely a relationship. So bear in mind the mental model is the assumptions that we're making that characterize a given situation and the assumptions that we make about ourselves. They have a profound influence on our narrative engine. Thus, the importance, going back to one of the topics that I explored in last week in the reading related to change and its difficulty, of engaging in what Chris Argyris, the great management thinker taught at HBS for many years, called double loop learning. That we're often involved in a sort of a single loop. We've got a strategy, and we engage in some activities and we assess the results, and then and what we're failing to do in that process is actually take a step back and understand, well, why is this our strategy? What are the assumptions and the beliefs that underlie all of that? And so critically important to surface our mental models, which of course are usually invisible to us. Thus the value of some kind of structured reflection, of journaling, which takes our abstract thoughts and renders them more concrete, and of coaching, because the mere act of engaging in a coaching conversation allows us to see ourselves a little bit more clearly, reflected through the lens of the other person's perspective. Also a question about, so you work with a bunch of, very successful leaders. Do they experience a sense of fulfillment and peace? And, are they able to kind of quell some of these anxieties and concerns? And I would say, to the comment that I made in the first class, well, it very much depends. It's certainly influenced by the factors that we're all experiencing today, kind of in this societal moment. But I would say bear this topic in mind for our penultimate class on success, because a lot of the research emerging from social psychology and related fields helps us understand that the more sort of visible, defined, kind of yardsticks that we use to measure or determine success are not necessarily pathways to sustained fulfillment, peace, sort of management of anxiety. There are lots of sort of well understood neurological principles that render some of those factors they have a relatively short shelf life. Also a question, well, what if my work relies on my phone? Well, I would say, in this moment, we're all very dependent on these devices. We've rendered ourselves dependent, even if we're not operating in a system that makes us dependent. All the more important then to figure out, how do I use it wisely? These wonderful, terrible devices, they're like very sharp tools. You got to grab it by the right end or it's not going to be useful. A question about balancing detachment with connectivity. What if I'm operating in a context where I feel this need to be on? I feel, like I've got to be responsive in lots of ways. And I would say absolutely, that's very much the case for a lot of people that I work with. And really important to not simply feel subject to that culture, and to recognize that it is a culture. It's a culture that is being created. There's a set of rules that translate into norms that govern and influence our behavior. And if I'm not responsive in some sense, maybe I feel anxious or I feel like I'm being derelict in my duty. Important to really step back and question, how true is that? In some cases, it's quite literally true. In lots of cases, though, we tell ourselves a story about it being true. And I think it's worth questioning that. Also worth exploring, what influence do I have over this culture? In certain circumstances, yeah, I'm absolutely governed by a culture. And if I don't adhere to those norms, the culture is going to punish or even expel me. And yet, is that completely true all the time under every circumstance? Or are there ways in which we can establish some boundaries? So let me just note, this is not necessarily or by no means exclusively, something that people experience if they're lower in an organizational hierarchy. It's also absolutely something that the leaders in my practice have to wrestle with. I feel obligated to be responsive to my employees, especially at a time of crisis. Understandably, very laudable in lots of ways. And yet, how do those leaders create a culture that allows them to create the boundaries that are necessary to step back, both to replenish themselves and to do some focused strategic thinking, which is necessary on a consistent basis. Also, there's a question about the relationship between systems 1 and 2 and logic and emotion. Really important not to conflate those two distinct concepts. You know, system 2 includes, system 1, sorry, includes and encompasses sort of aspects of logical reasoning and emotion. System 2 assesses the system 1 impulses, both from a logical perspective and from an emotional perspective. So it's inaccurate to say, incomplete to say that system 1 is emotional and system 2 is sort of characterized by logical reasoning. It's also, I think, a really important point that will get explored in greater length in next week's class on emotion, and really is the central focus of one of the core readings by an eminent neuroscientist named Antonio Damasio, who's taught at USC for many years and who's kind of a leading figure in the exploration of emotion and understanding. Emotion and logical reasoning are not opposed to each other. We sometimes experience it that way. It's not the way our brains work. Emotion is an important input into the reasoning process. Now, can uncontrolled and unregulated emotion lead us astray, lead us to make suboptimal decisions? Absolutely. Damasio stipulates that. But really important to recognize, it's not the case that system 1 emotions, system 1 is an emotional set of impulses that are counterposed by system 2 logic. That's a very reductive and inaccurate way of understanding these systems. Lastly, just some tactical questions. How to track meditation? Is guided meditation useful? How many minutes are recommended? I talk about all of those questions in the reading for today, specifically about meditation and framing it as a workout. But just very simply, the app I use is called Don't Break the Chain. It's an incredibly old school, simple website that simply allows you to indicate on a given day, did you perform a desired task or not? In my case, did I meditate or not? It's incredibly simple. And I think keeping tools like this simple in this context are more useful than anything. Guided meditation can be quite useful. And it's important to figure out what works for me on a subjective basis. There's a ton of advice on how to meditate, and it's important for you to assess, well, what am I finding useful and what am I finding unhelpful? If somebody's telling you to meditate in a way that you find unhelpful, then don't feel, a sense of obligation in pursuing a certain path is essentially a recipe for failure, because you'll experience some resistance. You're unlikely to persist with it. That's a topic that or the frame that we'll explore in 2 weeks in our class on happiness. Minutes of meditation, as I mentioned very briefly earlier, sort of optimal with regard to what we know results in measurable change in brain structure is basically 10 minutes a day for 2 months. That's, if you boil it down, that's what it results in. And there's a lot more research on the link that takes you back to the archive for the additional readings in my archive for the Stanford course. With that, let me just push on and sum up a few key concepts and tee some things up for next time. So again, if I get back on a soapbox, I want you to start thinking about attention as your most precious resource. And of course, just recognize that a function of the human condition is that we will struggle to direct it effectively. This is the reasons why are features for the species that we often experience as bugs. Willpower is not going to be enough. You cannot simply say, I'm going to focus on this and I'm going to ignore that indefinitely. And that's good. We want to have emotions, be able to disrupt conscious thought. That keeps us safe. And yet again, it can also prevent us from accomplishing some goals. Thus the importance, the paramount importance of habitual practices. This is not going to get easier. It will get harder as you rise in an organizational hierarchy. As you become more senior in your career, more people want the leader's attention. And everybody wants the leader in the meeting. Everybody wants the leader's feedback. So you do enjoy certain perks. You are able to exert influence in some ways, but just bear in mind, earlier in your career, you may lack the control that you would desire, but people may not be that interested. They may not want your attention that much. This is going to change dramatically the more senior you get. And sadly, people don't care how much it costs the leader. Nobody's thinking, no, I mean, the theme in my work, I talk about with many clients, is we habitually fail to empathize up. We're not thinking about, hey, if I'm looking for this, if I'm requesting the leader's attention on this, how much is it costing them? What are they sacrificing? And so if you are anticipating finding yourself in an advanced position like that, bear in mind, you're not going to get a lot of empathy. So it's really important now to begin today by treating your attention like a resource. Let me refer back to one additional question that got raised was, well, how do I experiment? How do I conduct the kinds of experiments that you are referencing here? And I think that, answering that question for yourself is really one of the core issues of this course. Essentially, I'm laying out some hypotheses that I'd like you to then translate into sort of behavioral experiments in your own life, and run those experiments and gather some data. Somebody also asked, well, what's been the impact on your personal experience as an executive coach pre and post meditation practice? Well, it wasn't like night and day, like I suddenly began meditating and automatically experienced this new way of perceiving the world. But over time, it's been quite profound. That has been a very successful experiment, drawing on research, drawing on personal experience. I can say definitively, meditation has helped me be better able to regulate my emotions and direct my attention fruitfully. And that's my experience. I'm asking you to then figure out, well, how do I take these ideas and influence and craft some experiments, gather some data, and then see what the results are. What does it encourage me to do? So I think answering that question is really critical to getting something out of this class. For next time, let me just say very briefly, for our upcoming class on emotion, there is going to be an exercise. It's called the Dimensions of Emotional Style, drawing on the work of an eminent neuroscientist named Richard Davidson, who's been generous enough to allow me to share his work with you in this course. The assessment consists of 60 true or false questions. In answering them, just go with what's generally true, what's generally false. Go with your gut. Do not deliberate. The more you try and stop and think your way to a right answer in this assessment, the less useful the data will be to you. It'll take you 10 minutes to complete it, 10 minutes to score it, then do the class 4 reading. Have a copy for class that will allow you to have a more fruitful conversation with your partner. Take note, in the reading, Davidson talks about resilience. What he means by that is very specifically a very narrow definition: recovery time from adverse experiences. Because in this course, we'll be talking about resilience in a more broad way, drawing later on the work of Karen Revich of Penn. In this context, Davidson's assessment, I reframe what he calls resilience as recovery time, much more narrow and precise definition. Lastly, video from this webinar and the slides that you just saw today will be posted to my site later this afternoon. That is it. Thank you again for spending this time. It is 11:30. I've kept my promise. I hope you have a good rest of the weekend. Stay safe, be well. I will look forward to seeing you again next Saturday. Bye.